All right, I think people will sort of trickle in as we go along, but I'll just start with a short intro of the webinar series that we have here. Welcome to the Green Shoots webinar series. In this webinar series, we try to highlight the diversity in research that we have and all the young talent that we have in the WildE project. So quickly, for the people that don't know or who this might be the first webinars in this series for, what is WildE? WildE is a project funded by the European Union that looks at rewilding as a climate smart solution to both the climate and the biodiversity crisis. And in this project, we will look at climate smart rewilding across Europe at 8 different sites, assessing the rewilding approach in these different case studies. And in this project, we have a really great team of researchers of all over Europe, including more than 15 young researchers and PhDs that are doing some fantastic works. And this is a mix of social and natural sciences, so we have an interdisciplinary project as well. And in this webinar series, we are trying to highlight some of this research that we do, and we will continue to do so also after this webinar. So we do hope that you join also any of our future iterations as well. With that, I am very excited to announce that today we have Angus Smith, and joined also by Arjen Buys, both from Wageningen University. And they work a lot on understanding different attitudes towards rewilding and what drives these attitudes. And today they will be talking a lot about their work that they've been doing on developing a scale that operationalizes the Nature's Futures framework. After the presentation, we will have time for questions and some answers. If you have any of those questions and answers, please already put them in the chat. You can do this throughout the webinar, and then at the end, we can ask those questions. So if anything comes along, just put the questions in the chat and we'll address them in the end. And do note that the webinar will be recorded and that this will be made available on YouTube after the webinar, so you can always look it back. And I think that's it. Angus, the floor is yours.
That's great. Thank you very much, Tim. And yeah, thanks very much everyone to attending. It's great to see such interest in some of the work that we've been doing. So yeah, just jumping right in then. So I'll start off with a sort of general introduction to this Nature Futures framework, as I appreciate that not everyone will have come across it before, and it may be a new thing for some people. So the Nature Futures framework, it was first introduced about 4 years ago by researchers from the IPBS. And the key idea behind it is that it's a tool that can be used when designing what they describe as positive nature people future scenarios. So these are scenarios or visions for the future, which are positive for both people and nature. And a really key part of this tool is that it makes it easier to account for a diverse range of perspectives on what is valuable in nature when coming up with these future scenarios. The framework was really created in recognition of the fact that we need transformative change in order to address the twin biodiversity and climate crises. And that in order to achieve this large-scale transformative change, we need to engage with the many different values which people and societies can have for nature. And the more we can engage with a diverse range of values out there, then the more people we can get on board and willing to take part in the change that's needed. That's not to say that it will always be possible to accommodate absolutely everybody's values, but by at least having an awareness of what different people's perspectives are, it means that we're at least aware of how different people win and lose with different situations or plans. And if we just ignore or discredit the values of some people's, then this is likely going to lead to mistrust and conflicts around the plans we come up with. And so with this importance of including multiple perspectives in mind, this is where the Nature Futures framework comes in. The framework can be used to help incorporate the diverse range of values which people can have for nature when trying to design these plans for the future. We'll see later that it can be used in a multitude of ways, as I'll give some examples of different ways the framework's been used. In order to incorporate this diversity of values and beliefs, though, what's important in this framework is that it builds on what's described as the 3 specific values of nature. That is the intrinsic, instrumental, and relational values of nature. These specific values of nature are sort of like the different opinions or judgments which people can have regarding what it is in nature that's important, or that's of value. They can be broadly understood as the different ways in which people value nature and differences in which specific aspects of nature people value. In academic literature, these different values are broadly categorized into three groups: intrinsic values, instrumental values, and relational values. So what's the difference between these different values? Well, intrinsic values are all about this idea that nature is valuable in and of itself, and that nature is valuable regardless of any sort of benefits which it brings to people. It's also associated with the idea that we as human beings have a moral obligation to look after and protect nature. Instrumental values then are almost like a mirror image to these intrinsic values. With instrumental values, the idea is that nature is valuable because of the diverse range of benefits which nature delivers for people. These benefits are often grouped into material benefits, which is things like timber, clean drinking water, food. Immaterial benefits, with examples of this being things such as how nature can support our physical and mental well-being. And then there's also regulating benefits, or how nature regulates our living environment. Relational values then are all about the relationships which nature provides, and how nature can shape both our individual and our cultural identity, and can also provide meaning to our lives. It's important to stress here that when I'm talking about the relationships which nature can provide, I'm talking about both relationships with entities in nature, but also relationships which people can have through nature. So an example of that, I enjoy hiking and mountain climbing because my dad would take me out to do this when I was young, and this is something that we bonded over. So this could be an example of a relationship which was developed and deepened through nature. And so what the framework does is it takes these three groups of values and translates them into what they call three value perspectives of nature. I'll go on to describe a bit more what each of these perspectives is about, but at this point it's important to emphasize here that a key part of the framework is the understanding that these perspectives are not mutually exclusive. In the past, there was maybe a bit of a narrative that people were either ecocentric or anthropocentric, and more recently with pluricentric added in as a kind of new category, but still with the idea that people tended to either be one or the other to some degree. The Nature Futures framework then recognizes that in reality, people are a bit more complicated in this, and that really one person can recognize and adhere to more than one of these perspectives at the same time. This triangle that you see here is supposed to summarize the framework in one diagram. And the idea is that you can point to an area in the triangle to say which of the value perspectives you adhere to. So if you were to put yourself in any of the extreme corners, this would mean that you only recognize one perspective. Or you could also put yourself in a spot which says that you appreciate and believe in more than one of these perspectives. For example, if you put yourself right in the middle, that would mean that you adhere to all three of the perspectives equally. The other important thing to highlight here is that this framework comes from an assumption that people do care about nature. There isn't anywhere you can put yourself in that triangle that would say that actually you don't find any of nature to be very valuable. And we know that sadly this lack of care for nature is all too common in reality. The framework is not designed to measure how much a person cares about or values nature, but rather what exactly it is within nature that they do value. So we can have a quick look at what each of these perspectives are about. And as I said before, they're very closely related to the specific values for nature, but they're not exact copies. So nature for nature is mostly related to the intrinsic values for nature, with the key principle behind this perspective being that nature is valuable in and of itself. It's about this idea that it's important to protect nature just for the sake of protecting nature, because nature has a right to exist regardless of whether it benefits us or not. Nature for society then is really all about instrumental values for nature. And that's important that we protect nature because of all the benefits and uses which we derive from it, such as food, timber, drinking water, clean air, opportunities for sport and recreation, etc. In nature as culture, it's the relational values of nature which are emphasized. And what's seen of prime importance is that the relationships we have both with and through nature, and also how nature shapes both our cultural and individual identity and our ways of life. So I appreciate that's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the framework and what it's all about. So I'll give a bit of time here just showing a couple of examples of how the framework's been used previously, and hopefully this helps to provide a little bit more clarity of what it's about and also how it can be used. So in this first example here, Kuiper et al. Used the framework with a group of key stakeholders to create some collaborative future visions for a relatively new national park in the Netherlands. They highlighted here how using the framework helped people to better appreciate where other people were coming from in terms of what they thought was important for the future of the park. And this quote here about how the participants talked about the importance of creating a joint sense of what the overall direction of the park should be, and also how they saw that there was a critical need for a shared set of key values and principles when coming up with future plans for the park, just helps to exemplify a little bit what I was talking about before in terms of the importance of recognizing and trying to incorporate a plurality of values when creating these future plans and visions. One of the creative things that the authors of this paper did is they asked the participants to come up with possible newspaper headlines, which summarize some of the things that they would like the national park to achieve in their envisioned futures. And if you look at the few of the different headlines, I think they can show quite nicely these sort of different value perspectives from the framework which people are coming from. So the first one says 10,000th species observed in the national park. And to me, this quite clearly exhibits a sort of nature for nature perspective, as they feel that getting species richness just for the sake of species richness is worthwhile. Then the nature for society perspective is clear in headlines such as a visit to NPHD makes you years younger, and more businesses settle in NPHD due to demonstrably lower absenteeism. Both of these headlines to me point towards some of the immaterial benefits of nature, which are stressed in a nature for society perspective. And then headlines such as Queen Amalia praises NPHD for broad value creation and Western Holland and global top 5 nature metropolises. It really points towards an idea of pride of place and how the park could shape the local identity of people being proud of their national park. And this really relates to relational values in the nature as culture perspective. Another example here then is from Mansur et al., where they used the framework to develop different visions for what cities could look like in one of these positive nature people future scenarios, and how they could look in a nature for nature versus a nature for society versus a nature culture scenario. So this again gives an example of how the framework is about trying to come up with positive future scenarios from these different value perspectives. And it also shows how the framework has this multi-scale quality, as in the previous example, the framework was used in a very specific local context. And here it's being used to try and show how cities could look anywhere in the world. And so that's just a couple of select examples to try and give a better idea on what the framework's about and how it's primarily about trying to understand the different value perspectives for nature which people can have, and how these different perspectives can influence what people want from nature and for nature in the future. So now I can talk a bit more about what it is that we're doing with the framework, which is developing a new psychometric scale based on the framework. And so firstly, just a quick word on what we mean by a psychometric scale. So really a psychometric scale is a measuring tool. Much as you'd use a ruler to measure physical distance, you can use a psychometric scale to measure some sort of psychological phenomenon. Because it's trying to measure something psychological, it's trying to measure something that's not directly observable, what is usually referred to as a latent construct or factor. What the scale really aims to do is to measure how much a person adheres to each of these 3 value perspectives. And so some of the reasons that we've developed the scale were, one, because some of us want to use it ourselves to try and explore attitudes towards rewilding in a survey that's coming up soon, but also because having such a scale means that the framework can be further used in other research, but in a more quantitative manner. Having the scale will make it possible to gain better understandings of what the value perspectives are for large and diverse groups of people. And having the scale will also make it possible to track how value perspectives for nature within societies might change over time, as we can use a scale at multiple points in time to see how things change over time. And so the scale has been developed with these 7 key steps, and I'll give a little detail in each step before presenting the final scale at the end. Our first step then was to conduct a literature review, where we looked at 22 studies which had either tried to operationalize the framework in the past, or tried to measure one or more of the underlying specific values of nature. From this, we identified a number of subdimensions within each of the perspectives. You can think of these subdimensions as kind of themes which occur within each of the perspectives. I'll give a little bit more detail on what each of these subdimensions are about later on. We then also used the literature review to come up with a reference table of potential items which could be used to try and observe and measure each of these subdimensions. Once we had this initial list of possible items, we then had an online workshop between all of the co-authors where we discussed if we thought that the items were appropriate to include in the scale, and if we thought the wording of each of the items was okay, or if they needed to be changed in some way. We also wanted to make sure and agree that we felt that we had an exhaustive list of subdimensions within each of the value perspectives, and to check if there were maybe any key ones that might be missing. This all resulted in an initial set of 28 items split across the 10 subdimensions. We knew at this point that 28 items was too many really for having as a workable scale, but we wanted to keep a high number of items at this point so that we could see which ones worked best out of them, with a view to cutting down the number of items based on how they worked later in the process. We also created the first version of the question stem for the scale, and you can see that in this question we asked respondents to think about nature in the future, and to then indicate how important they think each of the items are, from a scale of 1 being not important at all to 7 being very important. And so from there, we then had a round of cognitive interviews where we sat down with people in person and conducted the questionnaire as face-to-face interviews. The aim with this was to try and check that the question stem and all the items for the scale were understandable, and also to check if it seemed like the items were putting people in mind of what we were trying to put them in mind of. We had a total of 16 cognitive interviews using a convenient sample of friends and family of some of the co-authors in both the Netherlands and in Denmark. The results of this step led to us rewording 15 of the items to try and simplify them and to make them more understandable for a general audience. And it also led to us removing 2 items entirely and to splitting one of the items from 1 into 2 separate items. And so now, just to hopefully give everyone a bit of a better idea of what the scale looked like at this stage, and also maybe a bit of a clearer picture as to what each of the subdimensions within the perspectives are about. First, we have the nature for nature perspective. And as I said, we identified 2 subdimensions within this perspective. And we had a total of 8 items for these 2 subdimensions. So you can see that the rights of nature is all about this idea that nature has a right to be protected, regardless of whether this benefits humans or not. And also that we uphold our moral responsibility to protect nature. Then nature as an end in itself is this idea that the point of protecting nature is just for the sake of protecting nature, and because it's important to have a healthy and diverse nature, just because of this intrinsic value of nature. Then in nature for society, we have these 3 subdimensions of material benefits, immaterial benefits, and regulating benefits. So again, material benefits is all about these more directly measurable and quantifiable benefits that nature provides for us, such as food, timber, economic opportunities. Immaterial benefits then is about those services and benefits that nature provides, which are not so directly measurable, and they're typically related to things such as physical or mental well-being. And lastly, regulating benefits are about how nature regulates our living environment, providing the conditions we need to continue living. And then in nature as culture, we have 5 subdimensions, with fulfillment and well-being relating to how nature can provide a sense of meaning and fulfillment to people's lives. Care and kinship then really typify this idea of people having a reciprocal relationship with nature and with entities in nature. Place attachment and identity relates to how nature can shape cultural identities and how it can also provide people with a sense of place. And lastly, spirituality, which relates to the potential value which nature can have for people's spiritual or religious practices and beliefs. We then moved to the first round of quantitatively testing the scale and seeing how it worked when we started to collect larger numbers of responses and as a self-administered online questionnaire. For this, we collected convenient samples of students from both Wageningen University and the University of Copenhagen, with roughly 100 students from each. One of the most notable things that we saw with the scale at this stage was what is known as a ceiling effect for several of the items. A ceiling effect is where you have a larger proportion of respondents than you'd reasonably expect, scoring the maximum value possible for 1 or more items. So bearing in mind that we had a response scale of 1 being not important at all to 7 meaning very important, we had several items with a mean score of 6.5 or above, which tells us that a large number of the respondents were indicating a 7, the highest value possible for several of the items. Without getting into too much detail, the ceiling effect can be problematic as it affects the statistical properties of the data from the items and how well it performs when we're trying to use it in analysis later on. At this stage, though, we kind of realized that the majority of students who were responding to the questionnaire were enrolled in nature conservation courses, and so they're potentially not totally representative of the general public. And so we opted not to edit any of the items based on the ceiling effect at this stage, but rather to wait and see how things looked when we repeated the testing, but with members of the general public. We also conducted our first exploratory factor analysis at this point. Exploratory factor analysis is where we're exploring the data to see if the results suggest that there are some sort of underlying factors, those latent constructs which are referred to previously, which can explain the patterns in the data. It also lets us see how the items in the scales may be related to each of these potential factors. Next came the first sample and testing with the general public. For this initial pilot study, we collected 150 responses from each of the Netherlands, Spain, and Denmark. With the help from a professional polling agency who collected the responses on our behalf. One of the main findings at this stage was that we could still see the ceiling effect in several of the items. And given we're now seeing it in the general public as well, we decided we needed to do something to try and address it. So we changed the question stem from where the question originally invited respondents to indicate how important they felt each of the items were. We now ask respondents to indicate how much of a priority they feel each item or aspect is for nature in the future. With the idea being that by asking someone to indicate how much of a priority each item is, invites them to consider the relative priority each a bit more and reduces the chance of people just saying, yeah, absolutely everything is the maximum possible priority. We also then did another exploratory factor analysis, or EFA, with the data which we collected in the pilot study, both with all the data from each of the countries pulled together, and then again, but with the data from each country separated out and treated individually. We saw that when we pooled the data, the EFA suggested a three-factor solution, which suggested that the scale was working in terms of being able to measure how much a respondent adheres to each of the three perspectives. So that was good to see. But then when we looked at the data for each country individually, it would sometimes suggest a solution of more than three factors, and also showed that some of the items were cross-loading between different factors, meaning that some of the items seemed to be relating to more than one of these value perspectives, whilst other items were just not loading onto any factor at all. So this is then where we really started to reduce the number of items to try and improve the performance of the scale by removing those items which were performing least well and keeping the items which seemed to differentiate between the perspectives the best. All of this resulted in a reduced and refined scale, going from the previous 27 items across 10 subdimensions to just 12 items across 8 subdimensions. And then we tested this sort of formulation again in the final study. And so for this final test, we again collected responses from the general public with help from a polling agency. But this time we collected just over 200 responses from each country, and from 5 countries rather than 3. We saw in this final study that changing the question stem had the desired effect of reducing the ceiling effect. At this point, we could also now switch from an exploratory factor analysis to what's known as a confirmatory factor analysis. So with this, we're no longer trying to explore the data to see how many factors there might be, but rather we felt we had enough evidence at this point to see how well the 3 factors explained the patterns in the data. The results from this confirmatory factor analysis look good, especially when the data from the different countries was pulled together. They generally indicated that the 3 perspectives we were trying to measure did exist in the minds of the general public, and that the items we were using to try and measure these perspectives were generally performing as we wanted them to. However, it's important to note that there were some issues with discriminant validity between a couple of the perspectives in some of the countries when we looked at the countries individually, particularly between the nature for society and the nature as culture perspectives. What this issue with discriminant validity means is that for some of the countries, the respondents did not necessarily see some of the value perspectives as being distinct from one another, but rather in their minds, there seemed to be a lot of overlap between them. I'll speak a bit more about this in a bit, but at this point was to remove another item from the nature for society perspective. This was done for 2 reasons. One, for pragmatic reasons and to try reduce the length of the scale, and also to get a little bit of a better balance between the number of items there were per perspective. And the other reason being to try and help address this issue with discriminant validity. So I appreciate this table has a lot of numbers that maybe don't mean a great deal to many people, but I'll try and talk through some of the most important parts to take away from this. So firstly, we'll look at what's known as Cronbach's alpha. What this value reflects is how reliably the different items are at measuring the respective perspectives together. Cronbach's alpha can have a minimum value of 0 and a maximum value of 1. And the closer the value is to 1, then the more it indicates that the items are measuring the same underlying latent construct. Again, there are different opinions as to what appropriate cutoff values are out there, but we were working with a cutoff value of 0.7. And you can see that for all cases, except for Nature Society perspective in Romania, the Cronbach's alpha exceeded this cutoff value of 0.7. And what this tells us is that generally the items which we ended up with for each perspective were reliable measures for each perspective. This final measure then relates to this concept of discriminant validity, which I mentioned before. Discriminant validity is about checking that the different factors or latent constructs are distinct enough from one another. We check discriminant validity to ensure that the underlying factors or constructs are truly different from one another and that they don't overlap or correlate too much. So in our case, it's checking if in the minds of the respondents, the different value perspectives were considered as being separate from one another. For this, we're really ideally looking for everything to be below 0.85. And you can see that for 3 of the countries, Sweden, Poland, and the Netherlands, there are warning signs that the respondents didn't see the nature for society and the nature for culture perspective as being truly different from one another. And then in Poland as well, there seemed to be some overlap between nature for society and the nature for nature perspectives. And so to wrap up, we can see from the results of the confirmatory factor analysis for the final study that generally the scale works and it is able to measure the 3 value perspectives of the nature futures framework. However, while the scale is workable, it's not perfect. In particular, we saw that the nature for society and nature as culture perspectives were not always seen as 2 separate things. And this is actually something that was seen by Kuiper et al. When they used this framework as well. The other thing we saw was how country and cultural differences in human-nature relationships and practices can influence the values which people ascribe to certain aspects of nature, which in turn then influences the performance of the scale. The best example of this is probably the item related to harvesting berries and mushrooms. In countries where cultural traditions around wild foraging are perhaps not as strong as they once were, such as the Netherlands or Spain, this issue is more strongly associated with instrumental values and the nature for society perspective, whereas in countries where there's still a relatively active and long-standing tradition of foraging, such as some of the Nordic and Eastern European countries, wild foraging was appreciated not only for the material benefit of receiving what you forage, but also for the relational values around continuing a tradition that's been shared by friends and family. This shows how multiple values can be ascribed to the same aspect or issue in nature, which leads to what is described as fuzzy boundaries and can make it difficult to assign one aspect of nature as being purely intrinsic, instrumental, or relational values. And so in terms of what comes next, as I mentioned before, we're looking to use this new scale as a potential way of helping to explain people's attitudes towards different conservation strategies and management actions. It's too early to be able to give any real numbers or results on this, but I can say that the early signs look promising. We're also planning to use the scale in an upcoming pan-European survey on the attitudes of the general public towards rewilding that's being conducted as part of the WildE project. We'll be using it as one of the many different explanatory variables to try and explore how people's attitudes towards rewilding are shaped and what influences people's preferences for different possible approaches to rewilding. The survey is going to be covering a total of 30 different countries, and we'll be looking to try and get a nationally representative sample of 400 respondents from each of those 30 countries so that we can get an accurate snapshot of the overall attitude towards rewilding, as well as what the dominant value perspectives are in each country. And so, yeah, that's kind of me over my time, really. But thank you very much for listening. And just to also accredit other members of the WildE project. And there are a couple of sort of reference slides there as well for me. Thank you.
Arjen, would you have some first questions to Angus?
Yes, thank you, Tim, and thank you, Angus, very much for your presentation and talking us through the Nature Future framework, as well as the work you and we are doing in trying to measure these different perspectives. You've spoken about these specific values for nature and how they relate to the value perspectives in the Nature Future framework. And I was especially intrigued by the overlap that may exist in the minds of the general public between the nature for society and the nature as culture perspective. I think in at least 3 of the 5 countries you investigated. I was wondering if you want to give a bit more detail about the intrinsic, the instrumental, and the relational values of nature and the differences between them, and maybe how they can help us to understand these differences between these constructs.
Yeah, it's if you look at the sort of history of how these different values for nature have been used in the past, relational values is a concept that's been around for a few decades, but has gained a lot more popularity in the literature in more recent years. And so it's a little bit more novel in our kind of common psyche. And I think this can lead to sort of a bit of confusion around what they're about. And actually, I was at a conference recently, and I will shamelessly steal a bit of a thought exercise from one of the presenters there on trying to sort of understand this difference between relational, intrinsic, and instrumental values. And so what I do is I invite everyone to think of, I'm going to say mother, but I appreciate not everyone has a positive relationship with their mother sometimes, so it can be any sort of guardian, caretaker, parent. But I'm going to use the word mother for reasons that will become obvious later. But when you think of your mother as a person, I think we can all agree you can see the sort of intrinsic value that that person has, i.e. they had value before you were born, they have value outside of being your mother, outside of any sort of relationship they have with you, or outside anything that they do for you. And then you also get instrumental values from your mother. Your mum looks after you, she clothes you, she feeds you, she houses you. And then you also have relational values with your mother. From everyday interactions, you develop a deep and meaningful relationship with your mum, and you cherish that relationship beyond those sort of instrumental values, beyond the fact that she looks after you, and beyond this sort of intrinsic value of her. And then I think a key part of that relational values part that I maybe didn't mention before as well is about these kind of repeated interactions over time, that you kind of, these are developed over time. It's not an instantaneous kind of thing that happens. And then we can really change that from mother to mother nature, and these same sort of principles kind of apply, really. We can still appreciate that nature maybe had some sort of a value outside of human beings' existence. It was a value before we, evolved, and I would say would be a value still after we go. And again, much like your own mother, Mother Nature provides for us foods, provides all the raw materials for our housing, for our clothing, everything. And then, so that's within these relational values, we can develop a relationship with Mother Nature if we maybe have a bit more of an appreciation for her, and with these interactions over time, and also how both our mother shapes our own sort of personal identity. Mother Nature can do the same for us as well. So yeah, that's maybe a little bit more information, and hopefully I found it a bit of a useful exercise in terms of trying to how to think these differences between these different values.
Okay, thank you. A very nice metaphor, and I may disclose that I do have a positive relationship with my mother. She's now 88 years old, so this also maybe gives some insights in how these relationships may change. I think for now her instrumental value to me is rather negative, but of course the relational and intrinsic value are highly positive. So I'll be happy to share that with her when I see her next week. Thank you. So maybe a second question. You mentioned that the nature future frameworks come from the assumption that people do care about nature, that they do have this kind of positive relationship to nature. But in reality, this may not always be the case. How will you address this issue in the upcoming European survey we will be conducting for Wild E on people's attitudes towards rewilding?
Yeah, so as I mentioned in the presentation, this Nature Future Framework Scale is one of the sort of different range of explanatory variables that we're going to use to try and understand how people's attitudes towards rewilding are shaped. And we recognized that, yeah, this Nature Future Framework comes from an assumption that people already kind of care about nature, and actually that's not necessarily always the case. And so how we're going to try and sort of address this within the questionnaire is we then have an extra question that uses an already established scale called the Revised New Ecological Paradigm. And really what this scale aims to do is measure sort of levels of environmental concern, which can kind of sort of tell us two things. It can help to tell us a bit more if people are actually concerned about the state of nature or not. But also we can see it as a potential belief that people might have about whether they believe there is a need for rewilding or not. And we can then imagine how that might potentially influence people's attitudes towards rewilding, because it might be that you have a really nature for nature value perspective, and you really cherish those intrinsic values, and you like the idea of a rich nature, but maybe you don't actually believe that nature is in a depleted state, and so you don't really see this need for sort of rewilding. And so I think by using those sort of combination of different variables together, that's how we're going to try and sort of overcome this kind of gap.
Okay, thank you. I see Tim, it's time to move on, I think, or do we have time for another question?
I think we would really like to hear some of the audience as well, and their input. And to start that off, we will be using the Mentimeter tools because we really want to hear what you think about the NFF framework in the scale as well. So, team from Opla, if you could please put the Mentimeter on the screen. And if you haven't used Mentimeter before, it's very easy to use. You won't need to create an account or anything. you can just use your laptop or your smartphone and go to the website menti.com and enter the code on the screen. And then there is 1 or 2 questions there that we would love your input on. So if you could please answer those, then we can go along with those questions. So let's give everyone a minute to answer the first question. Megan, can you already see some of the answers coming in?
That's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting that some people do really put themselves at the extreme end of one of the corners, and really just aligning is just purely nature for nature, which is, of course, is a completely valid perspective. What people tend to see more often, and what we're kind of actually seeing now as more responses come in, is more of a clustering towards the kind of middle, and this idea that actually people are a mixture of the 3 different perspectives together. And you can see people are understanding that, you know, they maybe are putting themselves more slightly towards one corner or the other, indicating that they do have a slight preference for one of the perspectives over the others, which is kind of what we expect to see. But again, even a lower number of people putting themselves at an extreme end of one or the other type thing. So again, I think this just helps to nicely kind of show how, in reality, most of us have a mixture of these different sort of perspectives and adhere to each of these perspectives with sort of different levels of how much we adhere to each of them individually.
Very interesting. Could we see the second question?
Yeah. And so, as I said, this concept of relational values, it has been in the literature for several decades, but it's really gained a lot more sort of popularity and become a lot more kind of commonplace just in kind of recent years. And so I think I was really interested to see it's such a new concept, particularly in sort of modern kind of Western societies. And actually, when they were creating the framework, I spoke with one of the authors behind the sort of paper that introduced it, and basically they had a workshop where they had lots of different stakeholders together to try and discuss these different perspectives. And what the author told me was that there was a group of Indigenous people who were part of that workshop, and they kind of felt like if it hadn't been for those Indigenous people being there, that they might have actually potentially missed this nature as culture kind of value perspective. And this idea of relational values was really brought to the forefront by them. And so I was really curious to see what kind of relational values can people think of outside of a kind of Indigenous culture context. But yeah, I'm also quite happy to see that people seem to have sort of understood what I was meaning about it, this idea of spending time in nature together with family. So yeah, these relational values are not only relationships that people have with animals, trees, plants, and nature and natural entities, but also the relationships that people have with other people, but through sort of some interaction with nature. Yeah. Foraging with friends, another nice example of that, yeah.
I see a lot of things that are having to do with people's childhood or growing up with nature. Is it something you saw as well in the rest of your skill development?
Yeah, we didn't really necessarily sort of look at where these kind of different values came from, but you're definitely right that the understanding is that generally these kind of values, most of our values and value orientations are shaped in early sort of childhood. Interesting though, I did see there was one item about foraging with a friend and foraging and being autonomous. And I spoke before about this sort of challenge we had sometimes with this discriminate validity between the different perspectives seen in the scale. And yeah, originally we had this item about going foresting for berries or mushrooms or whatever, and we said, oh, well, we kind of really think that this is a nature for society thing because you're getting a material benefit from nature, you're physically collecting these kind of things. But actually, in reality, people can see it as both the sort of for the instrumental value, for the material benefits, but clearly people also ascribe relational values to that action. You know what I mean? It's an activity that they can do with friends, with family, that maybe a friend taught them or someone in their family taught them how to go and forage. And so that's a sort of special relationship that they've developed through an interaction with nature. Yeah. And again, that identity as a naturalist and bug lover, this idea that relational values can really shape our identity and our sort of way of life. Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you all for putting in the answers to these questions. We also have a number of other questions in the Q&A that are already in the chat, so I would like to move on to that. And I think the first one that was asked was, did you include questions about participants' job roles or background to identify any potential biases, as you did with the identifying the nature conservation programs bias in the things? And Angus and Arjen, I think I will be asking these questions to you both, so feel free to answer how you.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, I can certainly jump in on that first one. So in terms of trying to collect about what kind of jobs the respondents might have, that's something that we did in the final study. But the issue that we had with it is we didn't create specific quotas around it. So we weren't deliberately trying to sample a certain number of farmers, certain number of foresters, and so on and so forth. And these samples are really sort of general public. And actually what we found was there wasn't very many of the respondents who were indicating that they were involved in things such as like forestry or nature conservation research or farming or whatever type thing. There were some, but not enough for us to really be able to say, okay, well, here's a sample that we can say what's the influence of being a farmer on what kind of value perspectives you have, or what's the influence of having worked in forestry on the sort of value perspectives we have. So it was something that we did try to look at, explore, but it wasn't something that we really kind of got enough data with to be able to really test these kind of differences and influences out, I would say.
And maybe if I can add to this, indeed, we had a few little people coming from a professional background directly related to nature conservation. So the downfall of this is that we could not analyze it. Of course, the positive thing, and I think that's also what the question relates to, is that in our sample, we did not have this bias of people being engaged with nature conservation or whatever. So we did have a sample of the general public, and the 200 respondents kind of represent then this general public without this bias.
Yeah, and actually maybe important to add on that as well, that for the final study, we did also have quotas around age and gender. So it was a sort of supposed to be nationally kind of, well, the number of people within different age groups and within each gender was supposed to be representative of the countries that the samples were coming from. But we did also include a quota around sort of urban rural living locations, with a third of respondents coming from very urban locations, a third coming from very rural, and then a third coming from these sort of kind of in between kind of regions. Yeah.
Interesting. And aligned with that a little bit, have you come across people that have negative associations with nature? For example, where nature is causing a nuisance, and how would that fit into this scale and into the NFF?
Yeah, so I mean, definitely people can have negative associations with nature. Yeah, probably a prime example of that would be things such as people having fear and issues of safety around large carnivores. But the Nature Futures framework, as I say, is really focused on envisioning positive future kind of visions and scenarios. And so it doesn't really deal with these kind of negative associations and concerns that people might have, but rather is more trying to create a vision that optimizes what the positive associations people have. But that's actually quite a good point, and that there's potentially another little gap there, that it can't be used to kind of measure more the kind of worries that people have. Within the questionnaire on rewilding that we're using, though, we have extra questions where we're really trying to ask people about what they believe the outcomes of different rewilding actions could be. And we give them the opportunity to say, oh, well, I believe the outcome could be positive or negative for a range of different issues. So yeah, it's not probably something that's really covered with the NFF skill, but it is something that's covered elsewhere in the questionnaire that we'll be doing.
Interesting. I have some questions around the analogy of the mother nature that you used. The first one, is it possible to understand better the mother nature values also for non-human species? How would that work? And the second one is a bit of a critique of the analogy, as in saying that you would develop a relationship with one mom, but not with other mothers. So how can this analogy work for encompassing nature that you are not familiar with, or that you might not even know that exists?
Yeah, that's interesting. So sorry, the first one again, what was the first part of that question again?
Is it how does the mother nature values work for non-human species, right? How would that relationship?
That's not something I have personally thought a lot on myself, to be honest with you. I find it difficult to be able to speak on behalf of non-human beings, but I certainly could still imagine that it can be used as a framework to try and envision and imagine the different values for nature that non-human sort of beings could have. And certainly trying to understand that, like, I come from a veterinary background, and there I would say mostly thinking of values related for non-human beings is very much about trying to ensure the kind of physical welfare of non-human beings, and it's probably mostly related to kind of instrumental values. And there's maybe not such a focus on kind of relational values, and maybe the importance of how relationships between different sort of non-human entities can really help to shape and add meaning to their sort of ways of life and sense of life. So yeah, it's not something I'd have to say I've put a lot of time or thought into myself, but I think it's certainly an interesting thought, and I at first thought, I think I can see it as still being a potential framework to explore these sort of different values from a non-human perspective. And then the second part was, oh, sorry,
if I may add on this, I think actually moving beyond humans, the first step would be, for example, my cat. And there the metaphor would work perfectly, because he does catch sometimes a mouse, but I love him for the relationship we have. And of course, I value his intrinsic value. With trees, it would also work quite nice. The trees in my garden, I have all three types of relationships with them. So I think the mother and metaphor would work also for non-human nature quite nicely, I think. But then to the next question, Angus, which is also quite interesting.
Yeah, so it was a question about how the analogy could maybe be used for trying to appreciate nature that we haven't directly experienced or that we're not familiar with. Was that right? Yeah.
Exactly. Right?
Yeah. So yeah, I think there's two parts to that, really. As I was saying before, these relational values, one of the aspects of them that is kind of supposed to be a relationship that is developed through kind of repeated interactions over time. And so you could maybe argue, if you've never had an opportunity to interact with a certain aspect or certain type of nature, that perhaps you've not had a chance to develop relational values that maybe aren't quite as deep or as strong as maybe nature that you have directly interacted with several times. What's kind of near is dear sort of thing. But with that said, I still think just having an understanding and this concept of relational values, I think we can still think about and appreciate that nature still brings relational values and is of importance because of that to other people, even if we've not sort of directly experienced them. Do you know what I mean? And again, part of this framework is really about trying to open ourselves up to these different perspectives and to really appreciate these kind of plurality of values. So yeah, I think that's probably what I would say on that.
Yeah, and I think one way to characterize relational values, at least some people do, is that they are non-substitutable.
Yeah.
I think this is quite specific for these relational values. So looking at my cat again, my previous cat, I loved her as well, and so I had relational values to her as well, but they were different relational values, different values. I think as such, this question, can we have a relational value with humans, with nature we don't know? That's quite a challenging one. I may argue we cannot. I'm not fully sure. And that I think also relates to this concept of relational value. It has been, well, it has been proposed a long time ago, but I think over the last 5-6 years it's really gained momentum. But we are still in the phase of discussing, defining. We had last week a nice conference in Wageningen on ecosystem services with a session on relational values, and we had with the panelists different interpretations of relational values. And actually, we agreed it would be nice to have a kind of a perspective paper on what relational values are. And there are these kind of papers, but I think there's no agreement yet. If we should have an agreement, but there's no agreement yet of what are relational values, what are the boundaries. Are relational values a kind of overarching concept which could also include intrinsic and instrumental values? Is it an additional concept? So I think we're still in the phase of teasing this idea of relational values. I think I and many with us and Angus think they are quite important in understanding our relationship with nature. But what it exactly is, what it entails, and what are the boundaries, I think this is still under investigation. And actually, one of the nice things about the research we have been doing with this scale is that also empirically we do find these overlaps between some of the items between nature as culture and nature for society, which also kind of, yeah, may help us understand so what is special about relational values and what's maybe not so special.
Very interesting. There was one practical question which I'll address before moving to some of the other ones. There was a question whether the presentation or the recording will be made available after this webinar. Yes, we will be posting the recording of this webinar on YouTube after this talk. And if you would want the presentation itself for the references and such, I think probably the best way is to contact Angus directly to be shared. But I have here also a question about the fuzzy boundaries. You talked about fuzzy boundaries in the presentation, but the question is, could these not also be the result of nature simultaneously having different values, right? Could the nature for society not even lead to nature as culture? Thinking here of the picking berries as a cultural practice.
Yeah, absolutely. I think these fuzzy boundaries do really come from this fact that a single aspect or item of nature, people can ascribe all sorts of values to it. And yeah, as we saw with this example of going out and picking berries or mushrooms and things, you know, I can ascribe an instrumental value to that because I'm getting a material benefit. I'm going to eat those berries and mushrooms. I'm going to feed myself. But people can also ascribe a relational value to that because they feel like they are interacting with nature and there's a reciprocal relationship they're having with nature. Or it can be because they feel like by doing that activity, they're sort of enacting and deepening the relationship with the people who taught them how to go and pick berries and mushrooms and things. And people can then also appreciate just the intrinsic value of, look at this mushroom, it's incredible, whether I'm going to eat it or not. And they just like the fact that that mushroom exists. And so because we can ascribe all sorts of values to the same activity, it does really kind of lead to these kind of fuzzy boundaries and this overlap between, okay, well, is this a nature for society thing or is this a nature's culture thing? And yeah, it's recognized even before these kind of value perspectives were thought of, that even with these specific values of nature, it was appreciated that there is a great deal of overlap between them.
And one question I have here from before in the presentation, is there also a future pathway that you see for urban rewilding?
Yeah, Arjen, you're probably more of an expert on that. It's probably more your area of expertise than me.
Yeah, I think you already showed one example from the paper from
Mansur.
Monro, exactly. I didn't remember the author. Um, but I think indeed, and actually in Wild E, the project this presentation is part of, we do have at least one case where we do focus on urban rewilding. That's in the Ruhr area, and Raven van der Poort, I think she's also in the audience now, but she's also a PhD candidate in Wageningen. She is investigating this example, and I think more and more. Urban green and urban rewilding is being as well, the options for urban rewilding is being investigated and explored in Germany, in the Netherlands, in the UK, and I'm pretty sure also in some other countries. And urban rewilding is quite an interesting case because, especially in the urban context, also all the discussions and the role of values and perceptions and the different views on rewilding come to the fore because rewilding may also have some disbenefits, as some of the question earlier was also that can have disbenefits. People may not like the appearance of rewilded areas. It can feel more unsafe, or actually it can be more unsafe compared to nicely neat lawns where you can see everything that happens. So yeah, there are developments in the urban rewilding. I think it is a growing field of practice as well as research.
And a bit more technical question. How about oblique rotation in the factor analysis, acknowledging the associations between different values? Have you looked into this?
Yeah, so we did use a sort of oblique rotation in the kind of factor analysis and things as well, particularly as we recognize with some of the items, although we did manage to address that ceiling effect, we didn't always have sort of normal distribution from the responses. And so, yeah, we did look at oblique rotation in the confirmatory factor analysis.
And is it essential to assess the three different values together? Or could you have more of a deep dive on the relational nature as culture possible without really looking at the other two aspects? Or would we then not really understanding the NFF framework correctly?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the NFF is, as I said, the idea is that these perspectives are not mutually exclusive. And for us, the scale is really about trying to understand how much people adhere to each of the perspectives. And so that's not something that we would be looking at kind of personally, but that's not to mean that that's not still a really kind of valuable and worthwhile area to look into type thing. So I would say that, yeah, looking at just the nature as culture, you're obviously not looking at the whole of the nature features framework, but you're certainly looking at one very key and interesting part of it.
We are approaching the end of the webinar. I think there's one question, which is a very nice question to round us off. The question is, will this scale also be available to other researchers in the future? And how do you think you are planning to make this available?
Yeah, so we are actually in the process of writing this all up, and hopefully we'll be sort of submitting a manuscript for consideration with journals at sometime soon, at which point we'll be introducing the scale and all of the kind of items that were used, and also a little bit more detail around particularly some parts of the kind of statistical analysis and things like this as well as sort of further discussions on what we kind of found with the scale and maybe some of the challenges of kind of using it a bit more moving forward.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and if I
Looking
can
forward
add
to that.
this, depending on
Are
the
you?
journal, we may want to share it already before publication on an arXiv kind of website. And if people are interested in using the scale in the research, over the next month, well, please feel free to contact us. We would be happy to share the scale, which is now final for us, that is, for publication. So it is this 11 items I think Angus has mentioned. So if you are interested in using it, don't hesitate to email Angus or me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Angus. Thank you so much, Arjen, for joining today. Thank you everyone who was in attendance. It was super interesting. If you would like to learn more about WildE, sign up to the newsletter. look at the website and follow us for the next Green Shoots webinars. And we hope to see you then. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today.
Thank you.